In the cold vacuum of space, where civilizations rise and fall like dying stars, one species has always been dismissed as the weakest link in the galactic chain. Humans, fragile, short-lived, and governed by emotion rather than logic, were never expected to survive their first encounter with true adversity. The greatest minds of 1,000 worlds had run the calculations, analyzed the probabilities, and reached the same inevitable conclusion: humanity would crumble when faced with real challenges. But what happens when the universe's most brilliant predictor of civilizational collapse meets a human who refuses to follow his mathematical certainties? What occurs when cold, calculated failure meets the inexplicable force of human determination? Sometimes, the most profound discoveries aren't found in data streams or probability matrices, they're found in the moment when everything you believed about a species proves absolutely, impossibly wrong. This is the story of Dr. Kethvar Zal, whose predictive models had never failed, and Commander Sarah Chen, who was about to rewrite every equation he'd ever trusted. In a galaxy where logic reigns supreme, she was about to prove that the human heart beats stronger than any algorithm and that sometimes, the greatest failures in prediction become the most beautiful truths about what it truly means to be alive. Dr. Kethvar Zal adjusted his 6 eyes to focus on the holographic display floating before him in the research chamber of the Galactic Behavioral Institute. The Zaltharian scientist had spent the better part of 3 decades studying the rise and fall of civilizations across the galaxy, and his predictive models had achieved a stunning 97% accuracy rate. Governments, corporations, and entire species councils relied on his calculations to make decisions that affected billions of lives. Today, however, his attention was fixed on humanity's data profile, and the results were as clear as they were concerning. The blue-white projection showed declining resource efficiency, increasing internal conflicts, and what his algorithms identified as catastrophic decision-making patterns. By every metric that mattered, humans were racing toward inevitable failure. Computer, display probability matrix for human species survival over the next 50 standard cycles, Kethvar commanded, his translator rendering the clicks and whistles of his native language into galactic standard. The display shifted, showing a 3-dimensional graph that painted a grim picture. The probability line started at a modest 68% and plummeted steadily, bottoming out at a mere 12% chance of maintaining their current civilization level within 5 decades. It was worse than he'd initially calculated. Kethvar made notes on his data pad with 2 of his forearms while the other 2 manipulated additional displays. Humans, he observed, consistently chose emotion over logic, individual desires over collective benefit, and short-term gains over long-term stability. They were the only species in recorded galactic history to actually weaponize their own planet's climate through sheer negligence. Their governments couldn't agree on basic resource distribution while their population continued to grow exponentially. Fascinating, he murmured, though his tone suggested anything but admiration. A species that achieved faster-than-light travel before achieving social cohesion. The mathematical impossibility of their continued existence is almost elegant in its precision. His research was interrupted by a soft chime indicating an incoming priority communication. The holographic face of Admiral Vextar, the Zaltharian Defense Council's chief strategist, materialized above his desk. Dr. Zal, I trust your analysis of the human question is progressing well, the Admiral said without preamble. Zaltharians rarely engaged in pleasantries. Indeed, Admiral. My findings confirm initial projections. Humanity represents a negligible long-term factor in galactic politics. Their species exhibits classic pre-collapse behaviors, resource mismanagement, social fragmentation, and a concerning tendency towards self-destructive decision-making. Admiral Vextar's 4 eyes blinked in sequence, indicating satisfaction. Excellent. The Council is prepared to move forward with annexation protocols for human-controlled systems. We've identified 17 worlds with significant mineral wealth that will require management once human civilization completes its inevitable decline. Kethvar paused his data entry. Admiral, while I appreciate the Council's confidence in my projections, I must note that human unpredictability occasionally produces statistical anomalies. I recommend continued observation before implementing any irreversible policies. Dr. Zal, your models predicted the collapse of the Vrex Empire 6 months before their civil war began. You accurately forecasted the Mineraloid Union's economic failure down to the exact quarter cycle. Your work prevented 3 separate galactic conflicts by identifying unstable civilizations before they could spread chaos to neighboring systems. The Admiral's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. I have no concerns about human unpredictability. Mathematics is mathematics. After the communication ended, Kethvar returned to his analysis, but something nagged at his carefully ordered mind. He called up historical data on human achievements and found himself puzzling over several inconsistencies. Humans had somehow survived a nuclear age that should have ended their civilization. They'd colonized 17 star systems despite possessing technology that other species considered primitive. Most confusing of all, they'd established diplomatic relations with 43 different alien species despite having no formal protocols for xenological contact. Computer, display human expansion timeline relative to technological development benchmarks. The resulting chart made no logical sense. Humans had achieved interstellar colonization while still using combustion engines for planetary transport. They'd established trade relationships with species whose mathematical systems they couldn't fully comprehend. They'd survived 3 separate plague outbreaks that should have reduced their population below sustainable levels, yet their colonies continued to grow and prosper. Kethvar spent the next several hours diving deeper into human behavioral patterns, and the more he learned, the more his precisely ordered understanding of civilization dynamics began to fray. Humans routinely made decisions that defied cost-benefit analysis. They expended enormous resources saving individuals who contributed nothing to their society's productivity. They maintained cultural practices that served no logical purpose. They even kept non-productive animals as companions, investing emotional attachment in creatures that provided no measurable benefit. Yet somehow, impossibly, they kept succeeding. His contemplation was interrupted by an emergency alert from the orbital monitoring station above Earth's moon. The display showed a massive asteroid, roughly 8 kilometers in diameter, on a collision course with Earth. Kethvar quickly calculated the impact probability and trajectory. The asteroid would strike Earth in approximately 47 standard hours, releasing energy equivalent to several million fusion bombs. It was exactly the kind of natural disaster that typically triggered the final collapse phase in his civilizational models. Perfect, he murmured, beginning to record his observations. This will provide an excellent real-time study of human failure responses under extreme pressure. Within hours, monitoring stations throughout the system were tracking the human response to the crisis. Kethvar watched with scientific fascination as the predicted patterns began to emerge. Panic spread through Earth's communication networks. Stock markets crashed. Several governments declared states of emergency. Some human communities even began engaging in the self-destructive behaviors that typically accelerated societal collapse during crisis periods. But, then, something unexpected happened. Instead of fragmenting further, human space-based assets began coordinating with unprecedented efficiency. The 17 colonial worlds started organizing resource transfers to Earth. Ships that had been competitors in commercial markets suddenly started working together, forming the largest emergency fleet in human history. Most remarkably, individual humans began making decisions that defied all logical self-interest calculations. Kethvar watched in growing bewilderment as Captain Elena Santos, commanding officer of the merchant vessel New Horizon, voluntarily diverted her ship's entire cargo of rare earth minerals to the emergency effort, bankrupting her family's 3-generation shipping business in the process. Dr. James Wellington, a terraforming engineer working in the Proxima system, abandoned a project worth millions of credits to join the asteroid deflection mission. Thousands of similar decisions cascaded through human space, each one making no mathematical sense individually, yet somehow creating a coordinated response that was rapidly approaching critical mass. This is unprecedented, Kethvar admitted to his recording device. Human decision-making under extreme stress appears to follow previously unknown behavioral algorithms. He began running new calculations, attempting to model the human response, but his equations kept producing impossible results. The humans were organizing themselves more efficiently than species with far superior technology and communication systems. They were making sacrificial decisions that violated every principle of evolutionary survival strategy. Most baffling of all, their individual acts of seemingly irrational behavior were somehow creating collective outcomes that exceeded the sum of their parts. The asteroid deflection mission itself defied all probability calculations. The humans had assembled a fleet of mining ships, military vessels, research platforms, and even converted civilian transports into a formation that looked chaotic to Kethvar's ordered mind. Their plan involved a complex series of coordinated nuclear detonations designed to alter the asteroid's trajectory by precisely 0.7 degrees, enough to turn a direct hit into a near miss that would send the asteroid harmlessly past Earth and into solar orbit. The margin for error was impossibly small. The timing required precision measured in microseconds. The coordination demanded split-second communication across distances that created unavoidable delays. By every mathematical model Kethvar had ever trusted, the mission had less than a 14% chance of success. But, as he watched the human fleet approach the asteroid, something in his understanding of the universe began to shift. The humans weren't just executing a desperate plan, they were adapting it in real time, making thousands of minute adjustments based on intuition and experience rather than calculation. Ship commanders were making decisions faster than computers could process the relevant variables. Engineers were improvising solutions to problems that hadn't existed in their original simulations. And, somehow, impossibly, it was working. The first nuclear detonation occurred exactly on schedule, followed by a precisely timed sequence of explosions that sent shockwaves through the asteroid's structure. Kethvar watched his instruments as the massive rock began to shift, its trajectory changing by tiny but measurable amounts with each successive blast. Computer, recalculate impact probability based on current trajectory modifications. The numbers began to change. 73% chance of impact. Then, 61%. Then, 48%. With each explosion, the odds continued to shift in Earth's favor, but Kethvar found himself focusing less on the mathematics and more on the humans themselves. Commander Sarah Chen, leading the deflection mission from her position aboard the converted mining platform Determination, was making command decisions that seemed to violate every principle of logical risk assessment. She was ordering her ships into positions that standard military doctrine would consider suicidal. She was dividing her forces in ways that reduced their individual effectiveness. She was trusting subordinate commanders to make critical decisions without proper oversight. Yet somehow, each seemingly irrational choice was creating opportunities that Kethvar's predictive models hadn't anticipated. The scattered formation allowed the human ships to attack the asteroid from multiple angles simultaneously. The divided forces could adapt to changing conditions faster than a centralized command structure. The trust placed in individual commanders unleashed creative problem-solving that no algorithm could replicate. As the final detonation sequence began, Kethvar realized that something fundamental had changed in his understanding of human behavior. These weren't the actions of a failing civilization stumbling toward extinction. These were the actions of a species that had learned to transform individual weakness into collective strength, to turn chaos into opportunity, and to find hope in the face of mathematical impossibility. The asteroid, its trajectory now altered by exactly 0.71 degrees, began its long arc past Earth. The humans had succeeded where logic said they should have failed. But, more importantly for Kethvar's carefully ordered worldview, they had succeeded because they had failed to follow the logical path. Commander Chen's final transmission to her fleet summarized something that Kethvar's 3 decades of research had never prepared him to understand: we didn't save Earth by being smart enough or strong enough or lucky enough. We saved it by refusing to accept that saving it was impossible. Sometimes the only way to succeed is to ignore every reason why you should fail. As the celebration began across human space and the immediate crisis passed, Kethvar stared at his instruments and realized that every equation he'd trusted, every model he'd relied upon, and every prediction he'd made about humanity was fundamentally flawed. But, rather than despair at the failure of his life's work, he felt something he'd never experienced before: curiosity about what he might learn if he stopped trying to predict human behavior and started trying to understand it instead. 3 months after the asteroid crisis, Kethvar found himself doing something unprecedented in his scientific career: requesting direct contact with a human subject. Commander Sarah Chen had agreed to meet with him aboard the neutral research station Kepler-7, a massive installation orbiting the binary star system that served as a diplomatic meeting ground for various galactic civilizations. The station's conference room was designed to accommodate multiple species, with adjustable atmospheric controls and variable gravity fields. Kethvar had configured his section for standard Zeltharian conditions, while Commander Chen sat in Earth-normal environment just a few meters away. Despite the proximity, it felt like they inhabited completely different universes. Chen looked exactly as Kethvar had expected from his research files: medium height by human standards, dark hair streaked with premature gray from years in space, and eyes that seemed to hold depths his instruments couldn't measure. What he hadn't expected was the way she studied him with the same scientific curiosity he was directing toward her. Dr. Zal, she began, her voice carrying the crisp authority he'd heard during the asteroid mission, I have to admit, when your government requested this meeting, I was intrigued. According to our intelligence reports, you've spent decades studying civilizational collapse. What made you interested in a civilization that's apparently refusing to cooperate with your predictions? Kethvar's four eyes blinked in sequence, a gesture that indicated both surprise and respect among his people. Commander Chen, your directness is refreshing. Most species engage in extensive preliminary negotiations before addressing substantive topics. Time is the one resource none of us can manufacture, Chen replied. I've got 17 colonies depending on supply runs, 3 first contact situations that need diplomatic oversight, and a galaxy that seems determined to remind us how fragile everything we've built really is. If you want to understand human behavior, you might start with the fact that we've learned to make every conversation count. The Zeltharian scientist leaned forward, his data collection instruments automatically adjusting to record every nuance of the interaction. Commander, my models indicated that your species should have fragmented under the pressure of the asteroid crisis. Instead, you demonstrated coordination levels that exceeded theoretical maximums for non-hive mind civilizations. How do you explain this apparent contradiction? Chen was quiet for several moments, her gaze shifting to the observation window where the twin stars cast their complex dance of light and shadow across the station's hull. Dr. Zal, may I ask you something first? In all your research on civilizational collapse, have you ever studied what happens to individuals during those collapse events? Individual behavior is largely irrelevant to macro-civilizational trends, Kethvar responded automatically. My models focus on aggregate resource allocation, social cohesion metrics, and technological sustainability indices. That's what I thought. Chen turned back to face him directly. You've been studying civilizations as if they were machines made of statistics. But civilizations aren't machines, Dr. Zal. They're stories. And every story is made up of billions of individual choices made by people who are trying to figure out how to live with dignity in a universe that seems designed to crush that dignity at every opportunity. Kethvar found himself adjusting his recording parameters, sensing that he was about to encounter data that his standard analytical frameworks couldn't process. Please elaborate, Commander. Chen stood and walked to the observation window, her reflection ghost-like against the starfield beyond. When that asteroid was bearing down on Earth, I wasn't thinking about aggregate resource allocation or technological sustainability indices. I was thinking about my daughter Emma, who was 8 years old and learning to play the violin badly. I was thinking about my engineer Rodriguez, who sends half his pay back to his parents on Mars every month. I was thinking about the baker in New Singapore who makes bread that tastes like the home my grandmother remembered from before the first colony ships launched. She turned back to face Kethvar, and he noticed something in her expression that his instruments couldn't quantify. You want to know why humans coordinate during crises better than your models predict? It's because we're not coordinating around abstract survival strategies. We're coordinating around the specific things we refuse to lose. Every decision I made during that mission was made by someone who was trying to preserve something irreplaceable and irreplaceable. But such emotional motivation should decrease efficiency, Kethvar protested. Individual attachment to specific outcomes creates decision-making bias that reduces optimal resource utilization. Chen smiled, and Kethvar realized he was observing another behavior his models couldn't account for. Dr. Zal, do you know what happened after we successfully deflected that asteroid? Within 48 hours, 17 different human colonies had established permanent early warning systems. We developed 3 new asteroid detection protocols. We created a emergency response framework that's already been activated twice for other situations. But, more than that, we did something your efficiency calculations would probably consider wasteful. Which was? We threw parties. Massive, expensive, resource-intensive celebrations on every human world. We wrote songs about the mission. Artists created sculptures commemorating the people who'd volunteered their ships. Children started playing games where they pretended to be asteroid deflection heroes. We turned a crisis response into a shared cultural memory that binds our species together more strongly than any treaty or trade agreement ever could. Kethvar's instruments were recording data patterns he'd never encountered before. You transformed a survival event into a social bonding mechanism. We transformed a survival event into a reason to keep surviving, Chen corrected. Dr. Zoll, your models predict civilizational collapse because they assume survival is the primary motivator for intelligent behavior. But humans don't just want to survive. We want to live in ways that make survival worthwhile. When you understand that distinction, a lot of our apparently irrational behavior starts making sense. The Zeltharian scientists spent the next several hours questioning Chen about human decision-making processes, cultural evolution, and social organization principles. With each answer, his understanding of his own predictive models became more fractured. Humans, he learned, had survived their nuclear age not through rational arms control negotiations, but because individual scientists and politicians had made personal moral choices that transcended national interests. They had established interstellar colonies not through optimal resource allocation, but because some humans were willing to spend their entire lives traveling to worlds they would never see completed. They had developed relationships with alien species not through calculated diplomatic strategies, but because they approached each new contact with a curiosity that treated difference as an opportunity rather than a threat. Commander, Kethvar said during a pause in their discussion, I must admit that your explanations are causing significant revision requirements for my theoretical frameworks. However, I remain concerned about long-term human sustainability. My models suggest that your species' emotional decision-making patterns will eventually encounter situations where individual motivations conflict with collective survival requirements. Chen nodded thoughtfully. You're absolutely right, Dr. Zoll. That's exactly what happened with the Kepler station incident 3 years ago. Kethvar quickly accessed his database. The Kepler station incident had involved a critical life support failure on a research station with 47 human scientists and engineers. His preliminary analysis had classified it as a minor emergency response case study, but he hadn't examined it in detail. The station was losing atmosphere faster than the recycling systems could compensate, Chen continued. The logical solution was to evacuate 32 personnel to ensure that the remaining 15 could survive until rescue arrived. But, the station commander, Dr. Elena Vasquez, refused to implement evacuation protocols. That decision should have resulted in total loss of life, Kethvar observed. Why did she choose collective death over selective survival? Because she understood something about human nature that your models don't account for, Chen replied. She knew that if they evacuated 32 people to save 15, the psychological trauma would destroy the survivors even if their bodies lived. Instead, she ordered the entire station complement to work together on developing alternative solutions. Chen pulled up a holographic display showing the technical specifications of the life support crisis. For 63 hours, 47 people worked without sleep to rebuild their environmental systems using spare parts, improvised solutions, and techniques that hadn't been tested under emergency conditions. They knew that failure meant everyone died, but they also knew that success meant everyone lived. What was the outcome? They jury-rigged a life support system that not only kept everyone alive, but worked so well that it became the basis for new station designs throughout human space. Dr. Vasquez's refusal to sacrifice 32 lives to save 15 resulted in technological innovations that have since saved thousands of lives across multiple emergencies. Kethvar stared at the technical readouts, his mathematical mind struggling to process the implications. She achieved a superior collective outcome by refusing to accept an inferior collective solution. She achieved a superior collective outcome by understanding that humans perform at levels that exceed normal parameters when they're working to preserve something they value more than their own individual survival, Chen corrected. Dr. Zoll, your predictive models fail because they assume that survival is the highest human value. But, for us, survival is just the minimum threshold for pursuing the things we actually value: connection, purpose, beauty, discovery, love, justice, wonder. As their conversation continued into the station's night cycle, Kethvar found himself confronting a crisis in his own understanding of the universe. Every mathematical framework he developed for predicting civilizational behavior was based on the assumption that intelligent species were fundamentally rational actors seeking to maximize survival probability and resource efficiency. But humans appeared to operate according to completely different principles, valuing abstract concepts that provided no measurable survival advantage, making sacrificial decisions that violated basic evolutionary imperatives, and somehow achieving collective outcomes that exceeded what any rational coordination strategy should have been able to produce. "Commander," he finally asked, "if human behavior consistently violates rational optimization principles, how do you explain your species' continued expansion and success?" Shen smiled again, that expression that Kethvar was beginning to recognize as uniquely human. "Dr. Zoll, maybe the question you should be asking isn't how we succeed despite being irrational. Maybe you should ask whether rationality, as you've defined it, is actually rational at all." She gestured toward the observation window, where the binary stars were casting their eternal dance across space. "Look at those stars. By any rational calculation, their gravitational interaction should have torn them apart billions of years ago. Instead, they've created a stable system that generates more energy and supports more complex phenomena than either star could achieve alone. Maybe they're not defying physics. Maybe physics is more complex than our initial models predicted. You're suggesting that human irrationality serves rational purposes that my analytical frameworks haven't identified. I'm suggesting that what you call irrationality might actually be a more sophisticated form of rationality than your models can recognize," Chen replied. "Dr. Zoll, when humans make decisions based on love, or justice, or beauty, or hope, we're not abandoning logic. We're applying logic to a broader range of variables than survival optimization typically considers." As the meeting concluded and Commander Chen prepared to return to her ship, Kethvar realized that his 3-decade career studying civilizational collapse was about to take a completely unprecedented direction. He had come to this meeting expecting to gather data that would refine his predictive models. Instead, he was leaving with the growing suspicion that his models were based on assumptions about intelligence and survival that were fundamentally incomplete. But, rather than feeling discouraged by the failure of his life's work, he found himself experiencing something that felt remarkably similar to what Chen had called wonder. For the first time in his professional career, he was facing questions that his existing knowledge couldn't answer. And, instead of seeing that as a problem to be solved, he was beginning to see it as an opportunity to learn something genuinely new about the universe. As Chen's ship departed the station, Kethvar began composing a message to Admiral Vextar that would change the course of Zeltharian policy toward humanity. But, more importantly, he began designing entirely new research protocols based on the revolutionary idea that predicting human behavior might be less valuable than understanding why their unpredictability seemed to generate such consistently remarkable results. 6 months later, Kethvar stood before the Galactic Council's emergency session, his presentation materials displaying data that would have been considered impossible by every predictive model in existence. The assembly hall contained representatives from 47 different species, each one struggling to comprehend the implications of the crisis that had brought them together. The Vrex Collective, a species known for their logical approach to galactic politics, had been the first to detect the anomaly. A massive dark matter storm, unlike anything in recorded scientific history, was sweeping through the galaxy's outer spiral arm, rendering faster-than-light travel impossible and disrupting communication networks across hundreds of star systems. 17 civilizations had already been cut off from galactic civilization, with more falling into isolation every day. "Counselors," Kethvar began, his translator converting his species' complex harmonics into galactic standard, "our combined analytical resources have calculated that this dark matter storm will continue expanding for approximately 847 standard cycles. Current projections indicate that 73% of known civilizations will be reduced to single-system isolation, effectively reversing 10 millennia of galactic development." The crystalline ambassador, their form shimmering with anxiety patterns, responded first. Dr. Zoll, your reputation for accurate civilizational analysis is well established. Do your models suggest any viable solutions to this crisis? Kethvar's four eyes dimmed slightly, a gesture indicating significant concern among his people. Ambassador, our models suggest three potential approaches. First, we could establish supply caches at key points along the storm's periphery, allowing isolated civilizations to maintain minimal contact. Second, we could implement emergency hibernation protocols for affected populations, reducing resource consumption until the storm passes. Third, we could begin controlled evacuation of the most vulnerable systems. And the probability of success for these approaches, asked the Mineraloid delegate, their voice resonating through the chamber's translation matrix. Combined implementation of all three strategies yields approximately 31% probability of maintaining current galactic civilization levels, Kethvar replied. However, I must note that these calculations assume optimal coordination between all member species and perfect resource allocation across the affected regions. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. May I suggest a fourth option? Commander Sarah Chen stepped into the speaker's circle, her presence causing a ripple of surprise through the assembly. Humans were relatively new to the Galactic Council, and their representative had not been expected to contribute significantly to the emergency session. Admiral Vextar, now serving as the Zeltharian Council representative, spoke with barely concealed irritation. Commander Chen, while we appreciate human concern for this crisis, our most advanced civilizations have already analyzed all viable options. This situation requires solutions based on proven mathematical principles, not emotional responses. Chen smiled, that expression Kethvar had learned to recognize as a warning sign that human unpredictability was about to challenge established assumptions. Admiral, I'm not proposing an emotional response. I'm proposing that we learn from the civilizations that are already succeeding in the storm-affected regions. The assembly erupted in confusion. The Vrex Collective's representative clicked rapidly, indicating extreme skepticism. Commander, our monitoring stations confirm that all civilizations in the affected zones have lost faster-than-light capability and long-range communications. By definition, none of them can be succeeding under these conditions. That's exactly the kind of thinking that's going to get us all killed, Chen replied calmly. May I present some data that Dr. Zoll's research team has been kind enough to help me compile? Kethvar felt a complex mixture of pride and apprehension as Chen activated a holographic display. Over the past 6 months, his collaboration with human researchers had produced findings that challenged every assumption he'd held about civilizational behavior. But he still wasn't prepared for what Chen was about to share with the galaxy's most powerful leaders. 3 weeks ago, Chen began, we detected unusual energy signatures from the Kepler 442 system, which has been isolated by the storm for over 2 months. Instead of the declining activity patterns we expected from a cutoff civilization, we found energy generation levels 340% above pre-storm baselines. The display showed detailed sensor readings from the isolated system. Where the Galactic Council's models predicted civilizational collapse, the data revealed massive construction projects, increased industrial output, and expanded communications networks operating on previously unknown frequencies. Counselors, Chen continued, the Kepler 442 inhabitants aren't just surviving isolation. They're using it as an opportunity to develop technologies and social structures that are more resilient than anything we've seen during normal galactic contact periods. The crystal and ambassador's patterns shifted to indicate profound confusion. Commander Chen, this data contradicts all established principles of civilizational development. How do you explain these impossible results? Chen looked directly at Kethvar before responding. Ambassador, 6 months ago I would have called these results impossible too. But Dr. Zoll's research has taught me that impossible results usually indicate incomplete understanding rather than flawed data. She gestured, and the display shifted to show similar patterns from 14 other isolated systems. We've now confirmed that 18 different civilizations are not only surviving the storm, they're using the isolation to accelerate development in ways that sustained galactic contact seem to inhibit. Admiral Vextar rose from his seat, his four eyes blinking in aggressive patterns. This is absurd. Isolation reduces access to resources, technology exchange, and cooperative development opportunities.
These readings must represent measurement errors or temporary phenomena.
Admiral Kethvar interjected, surprising himself with his willingness to contradict his superior. I have personally verified these measurements. Furthermore, I believe Commander Chen's analysis reveals fundamental flaws in our understanding of optimal civilization development patterns.
The assembly fell silent as the galaxy's most respected expert on civilizational analysis prepared to challenge decades of accepted wisdom. Kethvar activated his own display, showing the mathematical models he'd spent 6 months reconstructing.
Counselors, my research has identified what I term cooperative inhibition patterns in standard galactic civilization development. When civilizations maintain constant contact with external resources and support systems, they tend to optimize for efficiency rather than resilience. They develop specialized dependencies that enhance performance under normal conditions but create catastrophic vulnerabilities during crisis periods. The display showed comparative analysis between isolated and connected civilizations during various historical crises. The data patterns were stark and undeniable. Isolated civilizations consistently demonstrated higher survival rates, faster adaptation to changing conditions, and more innovative solutions to resource limitations. However, Kethvar continued, the civilizations that demonstrate the highest success rates during isolation periods are those that maintain what Commander Chen has taught me to recognize as value-driven decision-making protocols. They prioritize abstract concepts like cultural preservation, individual dignity, and collective purpose over pure efficiency optimization.
Chen stepped forward again. Dr. Zoll's research confirms what we've learned from studying the storm-affected systems. The civilizations that are thriving in isolation aren't just developing better technology or more efficient resource allocation. They're developing stronger reasons to survive and grow. She activated a new display showing cultural and social development patterns in the isolated systems. The Kepler 442 inhabitants have created art forms that didn't exist before the storm. They've developed educational systems that produce more innovative problem solvers per capita than any galactic standard curriculum. They've established social structures that reduce conflict while increasing individual creativity and satisfaction. The mineraloid delegate's voice carried skeptical harmonics. Commander Chen, these developments may be culturally interesting, but how do they address the practical challenge of maintaining civilization during extended isolation? Chen's response surprised even Kethvar. Delegate, they don't just address the challenge. They eliminate it. When a civilization becomes genuinely resilient rather than merely efficient, isolation becomes an opportunity rather than a threat. She gestured, and the display showed long-term projection models that Kethvar's team had developed using their new analytical frameworks. Based on current development trajectories, the civilizations that spend the next 847 cycles in storm-imposed isolation will emerge with technological capabilities, social structures, and cultural resilience that exceed anything the connected galaxy has achieved in 10 millennia of cooperative development. The implications hung in the assembly hall like a challenge to everything the galactic community had believed about progress, cooperation, and survival. Admiral Vextar's expression cycled through patterns indicating shock, denial, and growing recognition.
You're suggesting, the Admiral said slowly, that this crisis represents an evolutionary opportunity rather than an existential threat. I'm suggesting, Chen replied, that this crisis represents a chance to learn what civilizations can become when they stop trying to optimize for external approval and start developing the internal strength to thrive under any conditions.
Kethvar watched the assembly as representatives from dozens of species struggled to process concepts that challenged their fundamental assumptions about civilization development.
For 3 decades, he had studied the patterns of civilizational collapse, always assuming that isolation and resource limitation were problems to be solved rather than opportunities to be embraced. But his collaboration with human researchers had revealed something that his mathematical models had never been designed to detect: the difference between civilizations that survived because they had eliminated all sources of challenge, and civilizations that thrived because they had learned to transform challenge into growth. Counselors, Kethvar said, addressing the assembly with newfound confidence, I propose that instead of attempting to maintain galactic civilization in its current form, we use this storm as an opportunity to discover what our individual species can accomplish when we focus on developing internal resilience rather than external dependencies.
Chen nodded.
Dr. Zoll and I have prepared detailed recommendations for each member species, based on analysis of their specific cultural strengths and adaptive capabilities. But the core principle is simple: instead of trying to survive this storm, we embrace it as a chance to become the kinds of civilizations that could thrive in any storm. The debate that followed lasted 17 hours and resulted in the most comprehensive revision of galactic policy in recorded history. But, for Kethvar, the most significant moment came during a brief recess when Commander Chen approached him privately. "Dr. Zoll," she said, "I have a question for you. 6 months ago, you predicted that humanity would fail when faced with real challenges. After everything we've discovered together, do you still believe that prediction?" Kethvar considered her question carefully, his four eyes focusing on data streams that now included variables he couldn't have imagined measuring before their collaboration began. "Commander Chen, I no longer believe that prediction was wrong. I believe it was incomplete." "How so?" "My models predicted that humans would fail to maintain the kind of civilization that prioritizes efficiency over resilience, external validation over internal strength, and survival over growth." He paused, accessing memories of their months working together. "I now understand that such predictions are correct. Humans do fail at maintaining those kinds of civilizations. But I also now understand that such failures represent success at becoming something far more remarkable." Shen smiled, that expression that had once seemed impossible for Kethvar to quantify and now seemed like the most logical response to a universe full of infinite possibilities for growth and discovery. "Dr. Zoll," she said, "I think that might be the most profoundly human thing I've ever heard a non-human say." As the Galactic Council session resumed and the member species began implementing policies based on resilience rather than efficiency, Kethvar realized that his career studying civilizational failure had evolved into something entirely unexpected: a career studying civilizational transformation. And, for the first time in his life, he was making predictions about the future that filled him with anticipation rather than dread. The dark matter storm continued its sweep through the galaxy, isolating civilizations and forcing each species to discover what they could become when they stopped trying to be what others expected them to be. And, in the vast space between the stars, Commander Sarah Chen's ship continued its journey through the growing storm, carrying supplies and hope to isolated systems, proving once again that the most important human characteristic wasn't their refusal to fail, but their refusal to let failure be the end of the story.